Hi, everybody. This is Derek, and this week is going to be week 11, and it's the third round of editing. So, I mentioned earlier what my 3 rounds of editing were, and we've already gone through the what and the why and the how. So, the what, really quick, is what actually happens, the why is the motivation, the backstory, um, and the how is finally the details about description and setting and what does everything look like. This is actually my favorite part. This is the more visual part of making sure you're building good looking scenes with emotional resonance and conflict that stick in readers' minds. Because even if you have all the right words, even if you have all the right conflict and your story is really good, the thing they're going to take away are the things that you made them see and the things that you made them feel. They're not going to remember the individual words in the story, which is why I also uploaded a video about a critique of some of the writing samples that were submitted, which were all really good. But one of the things that I personally pointed out was that if you use too many fancy words, it can actually be distracting. So we'll talk also about that, how sometimes simplicity is better, or if you're going to use a lot of fancy words, focus on putting them in the most impactful scenes. You might also feel like it's a little weird. We finished the first rough draft. It seems like you would go into editing or proofreading or finding the typos and the mistakes, and I haven't talked at all about that yet. We'll get into that next week. And the reason is you can't really improve the visual stuff that we're going to talk about this week until you've already done the first 2 passes. So until everything is in the right place and until you've figured out how to make it all make sense and give your characters proper motivation to do the things that they do, you don't know if you're going to have to cut scenes or if your story makes any sense. So once everything's in the right place and you've solved the big story issues or the plot holes or the knowledge gaps, then you can actually go in and fine tune the details and get to work on enhancing, the actual content of your story. And that means actually, even at this stage, we will be adding more material and probably be doing some new writing for the first time, which is why it doesn't make sense to do proofreading or editing earlier, because there's a good chance you're going to introduce new mistakes here while you're making the novel better. And that's totally okay. In previous sections, especially for writing the first rough draft, but even for the first couple editing passes, I haven't told you to be careful about fixing the sentences because I think that would have been a wasted effort. This is also why a developmental edit or a manuscript critique or review usually comes before a line edit. Line editing is when you go in line by line and shift things around, reorganize sentences or words. Because even if you move around all the words and you have really beautiful sentences and words, that's not really the value. The value is in the bigger picture, story, conflict, characterization, description, etc. It's nice to use beautiful words, although I think it can get distracting if you overuse them. But now we've gotten through the rough draft and the first few rounds of edits. Everything should be in the right place. Now is when you do want to beautify or polish a little bit. And personally, I'm not a huge fan of what's called purple prose, or it would be adornment or embellishment. I think it can be a little bit like showing off your grasp of the English language when you throw a bunch of fancy terms in there. But there's a place for it. I think at this stage, you should really be focused on making sure it's a smooth reading experience. So if you have a lot of repetition, if you have really long, clunky sentences, clunkiness is something I'll comment a lot on when I edit, but it's anything that makes me stumble. If I'm reading, even if the words are really beautiful, if I have to slow down to make sense of the unusual sentence structure or the unusual word choice, if I can't really clearly picture what's happening in the scene, or who's talking or what's going on or why it matters, that's what I would call clunky. That's kind of tripping your readers up. So I would focus at this point on trying to smoothen your sentences, to get rid of unnecessary language, to make it a smoother reading experience. So that's why I really like this picture that I found. The eyebrows, the eyelashes are just the natural growth that's already there. Maybe you already have a really strong story. Now we're just making it a little prettier. So on the one hand, we are cutting away any long eyebrow hairs that stand out or stick out and trip readers and take away from the whole picture. On the other hand, we are adding little adornments or embellishments in the right place with a certain kind of balance. If they just put these everywhere, for example, even up here, this is too literal for a metaphor, but you can see how these little adornments, some have a leaf, some are cut in half so that they frame the actual story. They don't get in the way. That's what we want to do with scene description. We don't want it to become overwhelming or to get in the way of the function of the eye. For example, I wouldn't put them all over the eye, or to distract from the beauty of the eye. We want them to kind of get along with or complement what's already going on in your story without becoming overwhelming. So some really quick tips here. This was supposed to be trim and sculpt, but the and kind of got carried away. Less is more. Like I mentioned, this is a writing style thing. I think Hemingway is an example of a writer who is very selective with his words. Some people spend, days trying to find just the perfect word. Hemingway has a very sparse writing style, but there are other beautiful writers with very flowery language, and that can work too. You just have to make every word count. Which means, is this word complementing my story, or does it draw attention away from what's going on in the scene? Also, I think, words that stand out, sometimes it feels like, where did this word come from? Is this in context with a character? Would the character be using or thinking about this word? Or is this the author showing off the vocabulary to the readers? Is this just the author choosing pretty words, even when they don't really fit in the flow of the story? Sometimes it's the case that one really good word can eradicate 5 or 6 other words. So sometimes it makes sense to choose a really tight, perfect word that communicates more than a whole bunch of other less perfect words. And that's okay if you can get away with that. Also, this is where you would start cutting ruthlessly. So anytime, especially with a lot of description, there will be repetition where readers already know this information, characters already know this information. Why is this information being presented again right now? You'd want to try to cut out that as much as possible. You'd also want to cut anything that doesn't have tension or conflict or new information. You want to be choosy with, does this matter right now? Is this interesting? Does this deepen the drama and the conflict and the tension, or does it reduce it by, being bland or to some extent boring? Maybe it's a little, short backstory about what happened in this place 5 years ago. That doesn't increase the conflict or the tension or the drama. You can delete anything that's not raising the stakes, or interest or suspense or intrigue comes from danger or stakes. If it already happened, I've mentioned the dangers of there not actually being real conflict in completed scenes because they're not open-ended. So similarly, it can be possible to get carried away with description and to have 3 or 4 pages. I think it's Tolkien for Lord of the Rings. I think The Hobbit, he's famous for spending like 10 pages describing a tree, basically, really early on too. So you want to be careful about not overdoing it with description. You want to find a way for description to take a back seat to the events that are happening in the story. And usually you need to hook interest with conflict before you start giving out all of the description of the scene. Also, this final one is you can use description to highlight pivotal scenes. I saw a meme on Facebook recently that said something like, it's possible to write a really good story with a bunch of bad chapters, something like that. And the point was basically not every chapter has to be perfect. Maybe there are some boring, slow scenes where not much is happening. But for your pivotal scenes, and by pivotal scenes, I mean going back to the plot dot, that 9-point graph that we started with that shows you the major turning points of your novel. Those are the biggest, most dramatic scenes where the most change happens. So that's probably where you would want to set those in really descriptive locations so that they'll have more of an emotional impact. The other thing that can be nice to do is to come back to pivotal scenes in a new way. So, for example, maybe the first couple times the scene is in their bedroom and it's pretty boring, but then the world ends and the house is destroyed and they come back to the bedroom when it's burnt away or something like that. You can use a boring, ordinary scene and come back to it in a completely new context. But otherwise, I would try to figure out how to make your scenes more interesting, especially for those pivotal scenes. So this is the third pass of editing, which I've called kind of the how stage. And the main thing you want to focus on here is how does this actually look? How do the pieces fit together? Can you see it in your head? Could you draw it as a picture? Where is everything in relation? These are the details that are going to make the story more believable. And it's also just easier to keep track of who's in the scene doing what. It can be offsetting if you're reading and you're like, I thought this guy was over there and now he's over here. If it doesn't really make sense to picture in your head, it's not the most important thing, but for keeping readers in the story without pulling them out. I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, but you want to keep your readers in suspense, which means it's a form of suspended belief or suspended reality where as long as things make sense in the context of the novel, you can get them to believe a lot of things. But if things break their own rules and don't make sense on a pragmatic physical level, like this just seems impossible, these two pieces don't fit together, there's conflict, you need to make sure those questions don't come up by either finding a way to dissolve the conflict. If there's a natural conflict between two pieces that don't seem to make sense, you need to at least mention that and explain it away so that readers can move on with their suspended belief and keep enjoying the story. If there are pieces that don't fit and you don't comment on it, that's just going to rub readers the wrong way and it's going to bounce around in there and confuse them. So you're going to be focused on how does this make sense in the details of the scene. And that can include the transportation or the movement or the location. Like if you're in a scene, you may want to map it out, like what this location looks like. And I'll provide some examples later on, I think. But what's in the room, if you're in a castle and there are 3 bedrooms, whose bedroom is on the left, who's in the middle, who's in the right, what's across the hall, where's the bathroom, when they're passing each other, if they're going somewhere, you have to kind of map all this out. Again, it's not the most important thing, but it will take readers out of, like, it's a basic thing, but it will take readers out of the experience if something just feels off because they can't picture it clearly. So that's why it's important to get this stuff right. You might want to think about object permanence, which means when someone puts down an object or they leave it somewhere, where does it end up? How do they get it back again? Often, like, they'll drop it or they'll stab somebody. Did they get the dagger back? If they throw something in a lake, how does it come back? Things like that. Even just, 10 scenes later, they go somewhere and they have an umbrella. Where did they get the umbrella? If they've been traipsing around the wilderness for a week, where did the umbrella come from? I think this is an example from one of my books, but I'm not sure from where or if I even solved it. But if they have an object, you have to let readers know that they have that object before the object is needed. So you can't just real fast. Well, you can. You can just say she pulled out the umbrella that she picked up from her room before they left the house. You could add that in there just to kind of fill in the gap for now, but it would make more sense if she picked up the umbrella while she was leaving the house earlier, except in the case, because I probably said earlier, you should skip those transportation or movement scenes if nothing's actually happening. So maybe the scene ended on conflict and we didn't get to see her leaving her house and going out onto the mission. So that's an example of maybe there wasn't a good time or place to communicate where she got the object. If possible, give the object earlier before it's needed. But if it doesn't fit in the scene, it's okay to explain where it came from within the scene before she uses it also. Um, I would I would try to put it earlier, even if at the beginning of the scene, she pulled out the umbrella, or she'd put mention it even if it's not being used. Like she pushed aside her water bottle, putting her umbrella, rearranging the umbrella she grabbed in her room, and then later on in the scene, she uses the umbrella for something clever, something like that. You don't want to make it look like there's a magical solution that came out of nowhere at the last minute. Like suddenly they need something to use as a zip line. Oh, here's this handy umbrella, which by the way, I didn't mention at all earlier. You want to try to avoid that if possible, because it can seem like there's another phrase that's called deus ex machina. It's a Latin phrase, which basically is a way that all of the endings of a story will be wrapped up quickly by luck or by magic. It's basically like a deity comes into the scene and just ends it. And you want to be careful about, especially the really important dramatic stuff. You want to be careful about solving problems with miraculous, sudden, unbelievable expectation. Solving problems with magical solutions. It could be really cool if she decides to use the umbrella that she has for, a zip line to escape the zombies. That would be an awesome scene, but you don't want readers to be like, why does she have an umbrella? Like it hasn't rained at all in this entire story. Why is she suddenly carrying an umbrella that we never mentioned before? So I got off topic about object permanence, but you kind of have to find a way to mention the important objects that will be used in plot events before they're actually used. Otherwise, it can just seem like you've got a magic hat and you're just pulling magic rabbits out of the hat, which you are doing as an author, but you want to try to make it believable by also, like, it's better for a twist or a surprise to happen. Like if the character has an umbrella which she suddenly uses for a new purpose, an unexpected purpose, that's a twist or surprise, and it shows the character's creativity. Whereas if the author just throws an unexpected umbrella in to save the character, that can pull you out of the narrative because it feels like the author is stepping in and helping the characters out. Kind of like in Hunger Games, where Katniss desperately needed something, and a sponsor, I forget what they call them in the context of the book, but they have these sponsors who just throw in presents into the game to help them survive, which worked in the context of that story. But you want to be careful about not looking like you're just throwing your characters a bone, or you're putting your characters in dangerous situations and then solving it for them. You're trying to disappear as an author and let characters do the work themselves. So the last one here is scene description, which I'm going to talk about more in the next few slides. Um, but for example, take a look at this scene. So we have the movement, but we also have the colors and the contrast, the body position, the hair whipping, the wind whipping her hair, um, the dew on the leaves. There's all these little specks in the air, which are like the dust motes. So in the scenes that you want to matter, you want to get as detailed as possible. And this can actually take a lot of planning because you may think, okay, for this scene, I want her in a black tank top and a blue dress. But when did she get changed last? Why is she wearing these clothes? You have to plan that out and think about the last time they changed clothes, assuming that all characters avoid conflict, and so that this scene is probably unexpected. Like the characters aren't getting dressed up for the dangerous scenes or dramatic scenes that you're going to put them in. So moving on, let's talk a little bit about just the description of the scene. You want to try to make an impact. So you can do that with a flash of color. This is just a picture that I found online of a really cool place. You can look on Pinterest or, search Google Images or whatever for neat locations to set a story. You don't want to copy anything explicitly, but you can get inspiration from cool looking places. And sometimes you can decide, maybe you just want to feature a really cool scene in your book. You can decide to make it a setting. You just have to provide a reason for them to be there, whether it's one of the missions or one of the, a property that one of the character owns. I have actually read books that are really good that all happen in the same place. For example, I think I'm reading like a book 4 or a book 5 of a fantasy series, and all of it happens in the castle around the one main room. So there's not a lot of scene description, there's not a lot of variation, but there's a lot of tension and story conflict going on. And that's fine, it's a really good book. But especially in the first book, I would try to have a handful of really interesting and unique settings where a lot of the action is going to take place. These could be unique to the world or the culture. For example, if it's a sci-fi book, you're going to have a lot of cool technology or something. If it's futuristic versus dystopian, they're definitely going to have, every genre, people read it for the scene descriptions to some extent. So the promise of a dystopian novel is the ruined wasteland that they have to wander through. I really like writing dystopian or post-apocalyptic because I get to write, the ruins of the buildings and the plants coming back through, and I like that stuff. But if you're writing something contemporary or modern, that's going to change. You can still take the expected scene of a genre and add new details to make your world building unique and interesting. One of the ways to do this is with a flash of color. You could have something in the scene itself. Generally, you want colors that naturally contrast. If you want to have a really visually stunning scene, depends a lot on the lighting and the color contrast. So, for example, the character wearing a bright red dress, then the background should be white or blue because there's more natural contrast. And also there should be like if I was doing a book cover design, there would be a glowing light around her, and then it would be darker around the edges, because whatever you're trying to feature, you have to give kind of a halo effect to get them to really stand out and be as dramatic as possible. So there could be a flash of color in the scene, built into the landscape or the room, but it could also be something the character is wearing, or it can be a totem. I think I've talked about totems before, but this would be like a little personal, meaningful thing that has relevance to your characters and is probably connected to a critical piece of backstory. It may not all come out right at once, but eventually it might become important. You can do the same kind of thing in the scene. Even if you make the scene visually stunning and really interesting, you also have to remember that good stories come from people and the emotional conflict that the characters are wrestling with. So you can have a really interesting scene, but you have to make it relevant and emotional for characters on a certain level. So one way to do this, for example, is to have, in the character's bedroom, they have a few little pieces of history that communicate the personality or the backstory of the character. So something like that, maybe not something one character is wearing or keeps, but maybe something larger that's built into the background. You can also have, I don't think I have it here, I might have it in the next slide, but something like interactive description where the scene and the setting is great and interesting, but it also has function because the way the characters will have to interact with the scene presents useful or challenging elements that will become plot events. The scene will also create a mood and ambience. I personally really like the kind of bittersweet contrast between current survival and happier times in the past. So you could play up things where characters are remembering, maybe this is probably later in the novel, it's not early on, but they might be revisiting a childhood location and finding either something of themselves or something from somebody else who's no longer around, that's touching, that represents life in the past when the past was light and easy. But it could also be something as basic or as simple as this is a happy, fun scene. There's going to be colorful balloons and confetti. Whereas if this is a dreary, depressing scene, it's going to be dark and moonlight and everything is in blue and really moody. So you can decide based on the lighting and the colors in the scene that you're communicating a certain feeling and that you want. I just noticed here I have the spotlight instead of spotlight. That's a typo. My point was depending on the background and the mood and the lighting and even the objects that are present in the scene, you can make readers feel the way that you want them to feel. And number 10, the point about the spotlight is that everything you decide to point the camera at, everything you decide to illuminate has a purpose. You are showing readers something to get them to feel a certain way or think a certain way about things. So there can be little details. You don't have to describe every single object in the room, but everything that you show readers should be chosen intentionally. And if it doesn't evoke the right mood, it might not be the right thing for you to show. So I'll tell you an example from the book I finished, the vampire novel I was working on last month. One of my favorite scenes, in the first few drafts, they're basically just on the mission and they have to stop somewhere for the night. So there's some kind of old abandoned warehouse. And in the first version of the scene, I had to figure out, they go upstairs, they're on the second floor, the windows are all broken. And in the first version, I pictured it as like a Costco or a B&Q. So there were all these really big shelves and there were a lot of shopping carts. So someone had made like a cage of shopping carts as a protective wall. And they were around the fire on the second floor inside of this like maze of shopping carts, which was already cool, but it wasn't relevant. It didn't allow the characters to show more sides of their personality. It didn't bring out the conflict of the world or the stakes that they are up against. So I did a couple of things using what I had to just make the scene better. I turned it into kind of a B&Q. I don't know if you have B&Q, but it's like a home furnishing store. So um, there were a lot of furniture setups. So because this is a dystopian world, they could be thinking about why would anybody need, the full kitchen set or the full dining room table, the chairs, all of this stuff that was not really functional, but was just decorative. So there's a really strong contrast between the survival mode they're in and what the world used to be like before. I also introduced a whole stack of mattresses. So one of the characters basically did a Princess in the Pea where she built a pile of mattresses and used it as a trampoline. So there was like a light, fun-hearted moment where she is jumping on the mattresses. And then they had mattresses to sleep on. So it's almost tragic and sad because they're basically using leftover garbage from 100 years ago, but also they haven't had mattresses to sleep on because they've been traveling in the wilderness. So it's like a nice, comfortable scene that shows off the inherent discomfort of my universe. I also added they discover an office where they find a corpse. So while there's that lighthearted laughing scene, there's also this moody scene where they find the body of somebody who was killed a long time ago. And he has a little pin that says vampire killer, and there's all these candles built into or burned into the ground around him. So they're trying to figure out, was he murdered, or is this was he a hero? Are people like, this is a shrine? People are celebrating him because he was a vampire hunter back 100 years ago before the vampires took over and destroyed all the humans. So previously in the first draft, that scene was fine, but it wasn't an impactful scene. What I've actually come to discover is that my best scenes, the most dramatic scenes that people remember, are not the conflict battle scenes. They're not the action scenes. Those are fun to read. They're fast paced, but the best, most meaningful scenes are the slow scenes in between. So the first few drafts, probably you have a slow scene that feels kind of boring. Maybe it's sort of relevant and you don't want to cut it because some things are happening, but it's also just not very exciting because there's no, fighting or arguing. It might be something where they're figuring out their next step. So it's important because decisions are being made and conversations are being had, but it doesn't really have a dramatic impact. But I've found that those really slow scenes can be your most meaningful scenes. That's when your characters have a chance to get to know each other on a deeper level, confide to each other a little bit, maybe feel deeper about each other, especially like later, the girl who was jumping on the trampoline, um, she gets attacked and almost dies later, like in the next chapter, maybe. So partly it's just a balance. Like I want readers to feel when she gets injured and to love her more. But to do that, I have to show more of her personality before the dangerous stuff. I think the other thing I changed in that scene is while they're upstairs on the second floor, they left Trevor, who is like the werewolf shifter, they left him outside because he was still a werewolf and he was too big to come inside. So she, the protagonist, feels bad about leaving him outside in the poisonous ash, but she can't bring him inside. So she's, getting up in the middle of the night to check on him, make sure he's okay. And then she goes down in the morning and they have a heart-to-heart romantic scene. So to make that scene a little more interesting, previously I think he was just outside on the ground, then he was outside on some plastic tarps. And because it's a home furnishing scene, I changed it to there were some hot tub displays. I'm pretty sure this is what I did. So he ends up spending the night curled up inside of, the ruins, the 100-year-old carcass of a ruined hot tub installment, which again highlights the disparity between the world a long time ago where people had, hot water pools and the world right now where they're just trying to survive. It also just makes it more unique and more interesting and more vivid if I can add in those kind of details. So that's kind of my point here is that you can use the scene building to bring out the suspense or the conflict or the emotional depth of your scene, even if nothing's really happening, just by planting a few of those visual things in reader's mind for context, it can kind of give support to your whole scene and make everything a little more impactful. So the opposite of all of that is to use cliches. And if people are telling you that your writing is cliched, or you should try to avoid cliches, a cliche is basically, I mentioned earlier how it's not a great idea to point to an external referent, and that's basically what a cliche is. Rather than describing the real scene, you are just mentioning something that readers already have experience of, and you're asking them to rely on their experience rather than telling them what it actually looks like. So I see this a lot with character description, where rather than building a real, unique, interesting character, you are just putting in a flat two-dimensional cliche. This often happens with antagonists, what are called the goons or the henchmen or the bad guys. So I see a lot of people use like cartoonish cutout cardboard stand-ups for those goons because they're not really important. They're just, little bad guys. They're not as important as the real villain. Sometimes they can be cartoonish or comedic because they're simple-minded or foolish, or they could almost be comic relief sometimes because they're just such low IQ, stupid guys. That's kind of, I see it a lot in fiction. It's kind of a way of doing henchmen that I think is not advantageous. Even your henchmen should be three-dimensional characters, with the caveat that you don't need to give everybody a redemption arc, which means the other thing I've found when I'm editing, sometimes there is too much information about the villains and the antagonist forces, because if I get to know them, if you see scenes of the antagonist forces or the henchmen being human, then it gets hard to figure out who is the villain, who is the hero. You don't want to sympathize with all the characters. The more detail you show, and this is also an important point, the more detail you show, the more readers will care about those characters. So for example, when you watch people talking on video, you almost can't help to feel like you know and like them more. Even if it's someone you originally don't like or agree with, when you just watch someone talking, you can't help kind of feeling these bonding feelings. They've done scientific studies on this reaction. So when you choose to focus on your villains or henchmen and you let them talk and you let them, like you show them in great detail, the danger is readers will start to sympathize for those characters. And then you have this moral binarism going on where you're not really sure who you should root for or why it matters. Especially if, everybody seems like they have strong motivation, you kind of want to make your villain a little bit sympathetic, or at least properly motivate his actions so he's not just an evil character. But on the flip side, especially when you'll see this in movies and TV all the time, you can erase the humanity of the henchmen by having them cover up. So if your hero is going to go and kill tons of people, some of those deaths can be dramatic by showing the other side, the character, by showing the other character's personality or backstory a little bit, so that when that death happens, there's emotional drama or pathos. But sometimes you may want your main character to just be a badass and kill 100 henchmen because you want to show that battle scene. The way to pull that off successfully is to make those henchmen inhumane by covering up their face. Maybe they're all wearing uniforms, they're all wearing masks. They basically are just the hordes. They could be monsters, they could be robots, but if they are human, generally you don't want to show their backstory or their characters or where they came from, because then you will feel sympathy for them, which can make you dislike the protagonist. If she didn't need to go and kill all of these guys, it can make her seem like the bad guy. So there can be a time and place where you have those cardboard standouts, those two-dimensional characters, when you're going to kill a bunch of them and you don't want readers to feel sympathetic for them or to worry, about them or to feel bad about them. But in the cases where you want to develop the emotional conflict or pathos, then you can build up the character before you have it necessary that the protagonist kills them, so that they can be racked with guilt. Anyway, so that's kind of my point here with cliches and two-dimensional characters. But you do want your main characters and your protagonist especially, and your main villain maybe, to not be flat or cliche, which means giving them a unique personality and character depth and description. Something I see a lot, for example, in fantasy, there's a kind of a two-dimensional bad guy. Maybe like I think it comes from anime, but like the bad guy who's got a scar over his eye, or the two different eye colors. There are some standard descriptions that a lot of an audience is familiar with that have become cliches because they're used so often. So you can still get away with them. Just try to make it a little bit unique and not just copying what's common for the genre. So finally, number 12 is sensory detail. So I've just been talking about the visual stuff, but you can also throw in, what do things smell like? What do things taste like? To get a little bit deeper with, if you can throw in at least every scene, or especially when you're focused on detail appreciation, you can throw in some smells or some sounds, or even some feelings, like she, put her fingertips against the rough walls, the rough eroded walls of the castle. That can just make things feel a little bit tighter. I didn't actually finish all my slides for this presentation. You can see I've got interactive. Oh, it looks like the E broke. That's why it's down here. But I'm going to comment on a few more things really quickly, then I'll give you another example. So an interactive setting, I kind of mentioned before, but also the description needs to matter for the characters in a way that makes sense for the action. So they will see the setting probably the first time. Anytime something comes up for the first time they see the scene or they enter the room, that's usually the first time they will describe it in more detail, unless they are too stressed out to notice the details because there's bigger conflict, especially in like a fight scene, or if they're running through an escape. So depending on the pacing, if the pacing is really fast and they have somewhere to be and there are immediate dangers, they're not going to be noticing the description of the scene unless it's relevant to their survival. They will just be trying to get through it to somewhere safer. So you also have to kind of balance, you don't want a page of scene description if they're running for their lives. You just want really quick. You can still create a really gripping scene, but you need to do it in a couple of sentences by just highlighting a few crucial pieces of information so readers can picture it, but without getting into all the little gritty details. On the flip side of that, for action scenes, especially when this is a big fight scene or this is a crucial scene, like the more important the scene, then the more granular you want to get with the specific little details. So you kind of have I think I mentioned this in an earlier video, but you have your wide lens and your close-up lens. So your wide lens is when they are going through the landscape, because the journey is part of the process and they have somewhere to be, and you can pan out and they can be like, wow, look at this view, when they're looking at how far they have to go. But when they're fighting for their lives, they're going to be focused on, the feel of the blade in their hands and the sand between their toes, on a much smaller, more detailed, what does this feel like to them? They're only going to be aware of like what's directly impacting them on a physical level. And also, every element that you introduce should be used and influence the plot. It's okay if it's just pretty landscape, but ideally everything will be used. So, for example, in this picture, which I think is the Columbia Gorge in Oregon. I think I've been there before, unless I'm wrong. But this is a nice picture, so it could be something they see. But for example, you don't want them to walk past it and look at it and be like, wow, that's really pretty, and then keep going. Unless it's going to come up in the story, unless it's going to be used. So for example, maybe they see a creepy old house, but they don't go in because it's creepy. They decide to pass it. You need to force them to go back in that creepy house anyway. So in this example, maybe they see that abandoned castle and they think that's a good place to stay for the night. So it could be a goal. It could be somewhere they are headed to. Even if they don't actually get there, maybe just seeing the thing on the horizon gets them moving in the right direction, because you want them to get lost in this fog down here, which is also building challenges into the landscape. So first they'd have to, get down the hill through the trees. There's probably dangerous animals. Then they would have to get in the blinding fog, which is going to be its own challenge. And then they would have to get up the cliff somehow. There's like 3 different obstacles, even just to get to this next location. And then probably, if I was writing this story, whatever they were looking for isn't in the castle anyway, and only creates more challenges and dangers and barriers for them. But you want to try to find a way to make the landscape look really cool and unique and interesting, but also make it relevant and useful to the plot events of the story. And then I mentioned this earlier, so I won't really go into detail, but color and contrast, if you can figure out how to make your scene really pop, is what we say in cover design business, or it's what clients say anyway. You can get the scene to really stand out by adding a really strong color. So for example, to get this effect would be difficult, but you'd have to create a way where she is outside in the moonlight, but then the alien drones with their red lights, highlight her hair in bright orange. It'd be difficult to pull off and make sense, because you'd have to create the right scene for it. But if you can find a way, then your scene will probably stand out and be more dramatic and be more interesting in people's minds. So let me end by talking real quick about the book I'm working on right now. I don't think I've mentioned this particular scene I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to share with you what it looks like and why it's relevant and why I made the choices that I did. So basically, this is the sequel to an alien invasion dystopian book, and they've escaped the mines where they've been prisoners for a month or two, and they get to the rebel base. And the first version of the rough draft, the rebel base was kind of underground. So it was like an underground rebel base, which was fine, but I'm changing it to an abandoned ski resort, which is why I basically just Googled abandoned ski lodge to get inspiration. I already had an idea of what this all looked like, but just to give you a visual while I'm talking about some of this stuff, and to show you why it matters, this is kind of a cool one. So the idea behind this was, my protagonist has already been in the mines for several months, so I wanted her not to want to go back underground, because I felt like, if the rebels are basically no better off than the miners, there wouldn't be as much of a contrast in scenes. And also just I want to have kind of an outdoor scene where she decides to spend the night outside because she hasn't seen the stars in so long. So to do that, I have to at least give some outside aspect. But the other problem with the underground bunker basically is it's hard to pull. It's pretty common in dystopian to have an underground bunker, but it's kind of hard to make that a really unique setting or scene because it's been done a lot of places. Um, so I would have to describe like where that came from. I prefer my dystopian to be more ruined landscapes. So the other interesting part was that I wanted. So the challenge is I have to find a way to make a rebel human base outside without the aliens being able to discover it. So my solution was if it's high enough in the mountains and it's really cold outside, maybe it's cold enough that the aliens don't pick it up. Like maybe they have heat sensing technology. At least that's plausible enough that it makes some sense in the context of the novel. And then I can also make this really cool looking scene. So most of it's still a bunker where the upstairs ruins are still like this old abandoned ski lodge hotel. So they have ground access, but they don't go out there very often because there's still drones and stuff. But as long as most people stay underground, they can have a pretty sizable community living underground up on this mountain underneath this abandoned ski lodge. But I wanted to make it even more unique and interesting, so I had to add in a little bit of backstory, which I haven't totally written yet, but I figured it out. Where originally, like in the 1910s or 20s or something, it was a big, really nice luxury ski lodge. But then I think what I have is like due to global warming, there wasn't enough snow, so it went out of business. It got sold cheap, and then somebody like a West Coast guru bought it out to use as a meditation retreat. So on top of this old, luxury stuff, there are Buddha statues and murals all over the walls in like bright pink and blue graffiti or murals, kind of like this one down here. But nice ones, like nice painted murals, maybe some um, nice sayings, slogans, like peaceful meditation type slogans. I like to, like I mentioned, I like to contrast in dystopian. I like to contrast the world before with the world now. And I also think it's kind of heartbreaking to show, people lived here before, like the stories of the people who have been lost. So I like my locations to have history because stories come from humanity and from depth. So I can introduce in the landscape these kind of ghosts of the people who came before and the culture that my characters have never experienced. This all in this book, the aliens only came 30 years ago, so it's relatively recent. But my protagonist is only 17 or 18, so she's never lived in a world without aliens. So all of this stuff is really, weird and foreign to her. She doesn't understand all of it. But some of the other characters do know the context and they do have deeper understanding. So the other important minor change that I made was basically like they go into the bunker and then they're there in the first draft. But later it gets a little difficult because if the aliens know where she is, if they find her, if they're able to track her, they will know where the base is and they'll just kill everybody. So I wanted to create some distance. So there's some distance between the entrance, which I built this long like underground tunnel they have to access by golf carts, which is functional because it creates distance, but it's also kind of an interesting scene. So it's an underground sort of bunker where they have these electronic golf carts that they have to drive for a few miles. That kind of solves the dilemma of, do I have them climbing the mountain to get to the ski loft, which is really far away? How do I transition from going, to the Riverside Valley up into the mountains? So I had to solve that issue and create distance by having like an underground, what used to be an access tunnel or a supply tunnel. So they have these little electronic mini carts. So that's solves the transportation issue. It also creates some distance. So later the aliens could find that access point, but maybe they still don't actually know exactly. They know that the rebels are somewhere, but they don't know exactly where they are. That's going to be useful later on because I can help to deal with the conflict a little easier and get away from some contradictions. But also, now that I have all of that stuff set up, I can introduce some extra scenes. I might have mentioned this in the past. You won't be able to see what I'm looking at, but I'm looking at the chapter I'm working on. And I think I mentioned there needed to be a little bit of a break. This is chapter 4 of a sequel. So it started with action. They were being hunted. They've made it to the rebel base. They're not in direct danger anymore. I need to build up some of the emotional resonance with a slower scene and also handle some basic hygiene issues like, they're hungry and they're dirty, they need to take a shower before they get into the other stuff. There's some other great real conflict coming soon. But before I continue with the story drama and I introduce new challenges, I want to make it count with some deeper emotional stuff. And I also want to do a little bit more world building so that readers are invested and they're interested. And there's a little bit of romance stuff I need to do. This is the sequel to a book, and there's a romantic interest, but I don't think they've never really, I mean, the whole book one has been pretty action based. There's a lot of drama. They haven't really had any time or privacy to think about their feelings. But now, for the first time, they're alone. And this may not be the final love interest, but I do want to have some potential to keep readers interested. So, and to set up later, there's going to be a different love interest, which is going to be, a critical part of the core drama. So, to build the difficult tension, I want her to have options. I want her to have more than just one guy so that she can have confused feelings or conflict based on, this other guy being jealous. So even if nothing really happens. Anyway, so this is the scene that I'm setting up with all of that in mind. And I haven't written this yet, but I have a couple of sentences that I'll have to build out a little bit more. So basically, they need to take a shower. She says, I don't remember the last time that I've actually bathed. The cabin, I suppose, with our little solar-powered device that could heat about 5 minutes of water at a time. But that was like months ago. So this love interest guy is leading her down to a place where they can shower. And all I have right now is notes. So it's not complete sentences, but a pool, tiles, the roof and one wall split with a giant tear like it had been slashed by a monstrous claw. The air was cold and I saw my breath. A thin pane of ice covered the surface. So they're in like an underground spa, what used to be a spa, but the water, it's filled with water. So it was like a pool or maybe a hot tub or something, but it's frozen because it's cold outside. And the wall and the roof is split. So while they're bathing, they can also look out into the landscape and see, I didn't write this part, but they can see like the moon and the trees. So it's a really pretty and a really interesting scene that also has function, multiple points of function, because not only can I introduce this cool looking scene, but also it's one that adds emotional depth between the characters, because they're stripping down, they're taking off their clothes. It's not really a sexy scene, but it's the first time they've been alone together, and they're stripping down to their underwear to get in the water and doing like an ice bath. Anyway, so it's just an interesting. There's a lot of like it's little tension because it's not real conflict, but she's never been around a boy before. She's known this guy for a while, but she's never really thought about her feelings or her attraction at all. So I have to plant those seeds in her mind so that they might develop later. So that's basically all I have to say on that. One little piece of advice I'm not sure that I really talked about earlier is that you don't want to do an information dump. So you don't want to just have a paragraph by itself describing the whole scene. You want to break up the description a little bit into sections with some action, even if it's just, dialogue or your characters doing things. You want to keep things moving and you want it to be a little bit interactive. She can come into the room, like she may notice. I haven't finished writing that scene yet, but for example, she comes in and she notices the basic big stuff, which is the hole in the roof and ceiling. Maybe I don't talk about the trees and the moon yet. Maybe I wait until she gets into the freezing cold water and I show the goosebumps on her skin, and then she's looking out at the trees and the moon while being aware of the guy in the water next to her. So there's a lot of things happening, but you want to try to get away from, even if it's beautiful writing, even if it's a beautiful description, you don't want it to just be sitting there because it's not the story. You want the story to always be moving forward, and you have to kind of sneak in the description so that readers can picture what it looks like while the story is happening. So I'll leave the comments on under this video if you want to share, if you've got a scene you're really proud of or a description you're really proud of, feel free to post it in the comments. Hope that helps. We're getting pretty close to finishing the book. So next week we're going to talk about actually the proofreading and the editing, the fine-tuned polishing stuff to, make sure it's perfect. Although I don't like using the word perfect because no book is ever really perfect, but you want to make it as clean as possible. So you do want to get rid of obvious mistakes or typos. So we'll be talking more about what that process looks like.